Okay, this week on the agenda saw the kickoff of our Learning 2030 series and the Classroom of the Future, the legal arguments for and against Bill 115, and weighing the merits of doing business with the European Union. The agenda's Week in Review begins with American Studies professor Mark Rice and whether history has anything to teach Americans about hubris. I think it's accurate to say that the American defense budget is larger than the next 13 countries combined. And Joseph Joffe has given us a good list of the previous four, or maybe now we're on our fifth incarnation, of how America is going to hell and can't keep up with the Soviets, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Europeans, whatever. Is it not also accurate to say, though, that every time in history an empire felt this secure about its position, it fell? And that just because it's been this way doesn't mean it always will be this way. Is that accurate?
No.
I can't answer about every country, every empire in history, because I don't know enough of that history myself. But what I can say is that I think that this narrative of decline does depend on this narrative of exceptionalism, that America is somehow special, somehow unique, and that it is not, it's not tied to the forces of history, and I think that that's incorrect. I think that the United States is, it's a wealthy country, obviously. It's the wealthiest country in the history of the world. It's the most powerful country militarily. It's the country that most people want to go to insofar as they want to go somewhere. It's the top destination choice for immigrants from all over the world. And so, I think that the United States is an immensely powerful country, obviously, and has been for quite a long time, and probably, and will be for a very long time. But I don't think that it's an inevitability. I think that the forces of history that affect other countries do affect the United States, and that at some point, if not impending, at some point the United States will no longer be the wealthiest, most powerful nation in the world. And as an American, I'm okay with that. I think that that's an okay thing to have happen.
You are not worshiping at the altar of exceptionalism enough then, Mark, is that right?
No, to my mind, American exceptionalism is more interesting as a narrative, as a story. It's not grounded in empirical data, as far as I can see. There certainly are things you can point out, the wealth, sure, the military expenditures, but that's a choice whether to make those expenditures or not. But no, I think that there's a powerful story that influences the way Americans think about themselves, the way that policy decisions are made. But I don't think that American exceptionalism is accurate. I think the United States is a powerful, wealthy country with a lot of great things going on, but I don't think it stands outside the forces of history at all.
Let's hold off on the exceptionalism debate for a second yet, but Joseph Joffe, I think what I asked the previous question about the defense budgets and about previous empires in history, I think I heard some irritation in your voice in reacting to that question. Tell me what you meant.
No, it was because empires in the past fell because they were conquered. Rome was conquered by Germanic tribes, and all the way down, empires used to rub up against each other, they fought with each other, and they ultimately killed each other. And that's the story of empire from Carthage, if you wish, or Persia, down to the four dead empires of the beginning of last century, like the Russian or the Ottoman Empire. Now, the big exception, that's one exception, we talk about exceptionalism, is America need not fear the fate of Rome or Turkey or Persia or what have you. There is nobody now and in the foreseeable future which could take on and could take out the United States. So that's so much for the history of empire. But should we continue about exceptionalism?
Well, hold off on that, because I'm going to get back to exceptionalism in a second. And I do want to read something, though, from Chris Hedges in The Walrus, which is a bit like Canada's Harper's Magazine, and that I can get you all to react on that. Maybe Victor Davis Hanson, you'll start with the reaction on this. Here's what Chris Hedges writes in the November issue of The Walrus. He says, America has been hollowed out by corporations that were indifferent to the working men and women who turned the nation into an empire of unrivaled power and unequaled prosperity. But management wanted more. Why pay $20 an hour when you can go to Bangladesh and pay 25 cents? Why settle for a few million in personal net worth when you can double or triple that? The empire was all ripped down. The work was shipped overseas, the factories were closed, the unions were broken, the social programs that permitted unskilled laborers to buy a house, send their children to college, and retire with an income, all of this was shredded. America, as doctors say of terminal patients, is circling the drain. This speaks a bit to what Sergey was talking about a moment ago. Victor, would you pick up on that and give us your view on whether you think America is circling the drain?
Well, that was factually incorrect, because we have more people in the history of the United States that are now on food assistance, for example, almost 50 million. Last month, we had the highest number of people who have ever filed for disability. This is, as a percentage of GDP, government and entitlement has never been bigger, and it's never been more generous. I'm not worried about what the 1% get. If Donald Trump or George Soros have 9 or 10 billion, that's their business. But believe me, their hot water is no hotter than mine. Their private jets get to New York maybe 2 hours before I do, sitting in the middle of an economy. I'm worried about the 99%. And I live in a state that's $16 billion in debt. I live in the second poorest county in the poorest quadrant. And this morning I went out to a food market. I saw the parking lot full of Honda Civics, Toyota Camrys, people with EBD cards. Again, malnutrition was not the problem, or a lack of appurtenances. There were all sorts of electronic goods that people were bringing out from Best Buy. So there may be a problem with America's spiritual health, but it's materially a poor person in America compared to most people in the world is wealthy beyond belief. And as far as military spending, the key is not dollars, it's GDP. The United States is spending still between 4 and 5% GDP. By historical measures, it's either average or below average, and it's not really a choice to have a big military. A lot of people would like to choose to have a big military. It's based on having an economy that's 1/4 of the world economy. As far as Barack Obama, I mean, I'm not going to get into politics, but he entered office with a bright vision of how he could change America by growing government. And for 2 years, he had a very rare in American history where you have a compliant Congress, Democratic House, Democratic Senate, and he did make a genuine attempt to do so. So we have a perception that we're in decline because, as I said, we have visions of utopia because it's wealthy, and we have a lot of problems with debt, we have a lot of problems with crime. But if you look at what constitutes being poor in America versus when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, it's just lunatic to say that people are in Dickens's London. It just doesn't happen, or in the old Soviet Union.
Sergey, let me get you to respond to that.
Well, the fact is that for about 30 years, the earnings in real terms of an employed male in the United States have not risen. The consumption has risen because of the enormous blow-up of the credit sphere. That's why so many people are so deeply in debt. But as far as the purchasing power, it has stagnated for over a generation, and that's a real problem because that's not what used to happen before.
I'm going to start by quoting from your book. What happens to learning when we move from the stable infrastructure of the 20th century to the fluid infrastructure of the 21st century, where technology is constantly creating and responding to change? Okay, lots to unpack there. Yeah. Learning in the 21st century. Start to unpack it for us. How is it going to change?
So I think when we look at learning in the 21st century, what we see is that there's an increasing substitution of context for content. And with tools like Google, with all the resources of the internet, we're in a position now where content is readily available. It used to be that when we, as teachers, would stand in front of a classroom, our expertise was in delivering content. Today, that's less true. And in fact, when I sit in my classroom today and a student's got a laptop open, if they're Googling what I'm saying and I'm going to try to be the expert, I'm going to lose.
Because Google is smarter than you?
Google is smarter than I am. The thing that I have an expertise in is putting that information in context so that those 20, 30, 50 sites can have meaning for the student in a particular kind of way. So I think 21st century learning has to shift from the idea of professors and teachers as being experts conveying content to being coaches, guides, mentors that shape what that content means in a world that's, as we said, constantly changing.
Do you think we as parents, we as students, we as teachers, we as administrators, we as school trustees, we as governments that set policy, do we understand that we are in the midst of this transition?
I think, in fact, The problem is way worse than that.
Okay.
I think it's exactly the opposite. I think that we're trying to throw more and more content at the problem when content isn't the problem. So we're in a process now where we're trying to test students more frequently about things that are less and less relevant. So the whole move to standardized testing, at least in the States, has so completely overwhelmed the system that I had actually a teacher in New York tell me they didn't have time for imagination.
Didn't have time for imagination because they're so busy teaching to the test.
That's right.
So, Mark, get us started. What's the best thing that digital technology can do for the students of tomorrow who are being born today?
I think the best thing that it can do is connect us, connect students to each other, connect ideas and experiences that are happening around the world. Because students who are born today are going to be living in a world that is always connected and therefore always next to, proximate to everybody. So the more connection we have, the more experiences we can bring into the students' lived experience in the classroom and outside the classroom, the better off the education will be.
Let me make the point that all of our viewers are making in their heads right now, but are too polite to say it, but I'm not. You have a fabulous last name for this discussion. McWebb. Come on now, that's just perfect. Christine McWebb. Okay, the best thing that digital technology can do for the kids who are born today.
Actually, I fully agree with Mark. I really do think that connectedness is what this is all about. And it is really my hope, actually, if I can express that, that the notion of the classroom or the word classroom will be an anachronism in 2030. And what I mean by that is that like we use, for example, the envelope as an icon for you've got mail, where there really is no envelope, or when we say that we're taping an episode of the agenda, when we're really not creating a tape of anything, but we're creating digital files, right? So everybody will still know and will be able to refer to the word classroom and know what that means. But the classroom will not look like a room anymore where we cram lots and lots of learners into one room and they're being taught at with exactly the same method, at the same pace, and the same content at the same time. But that classroom really will break out of that homogeneity or sameness and will become a much more unstructured environment. So where learning really can take place anywhere at any time.
John, you want to add to that list?
Yeah, I think technology has the opportunity to really transform how we all learn. You know, if you look at today, you've got students that are going through the elementary school system and high schools that are leveraging this technology each and every day. And it's the ability for us to be able to not only give them the best experiences that they can get for the teaching and learning, but it's also to be able to reach them no matter where they are in the world. So if it's a small community in Northern Ontario that normally would have to send their kids to school in Thunder Bay to be able to get their high school education, they could stay home and be part of that community. It's the ability to break down those walls, as you said, to be able to make experiential learning, being able to go out into the world and thinking of the world as a classroom, and being able to capture and share all of those learning experiences and bring them back and demonstrate and to do more things like authentic assessment and to really leverage different types of technology to really have that transformational impact.
Can you give us some sense about the classroom of the future, which you already told us won't necessarily really be a classroom, what it will look like?
That's going to be very difficult to predict, obviously. I mean, given that, it's only been 6 years since we've had smartphones and iPads, God knows what's going to happen 20 years from now. But what I actually think one of the biggest changes is going to be is the notion of the textbook. So, I mean, if you have a printed textbook, there it is, it's static. If there's an error in it, if you want to change something, you can't do it unless you put out a new edition. So to my mind, the new classroom will really use online technologies such as the Learn environment as a textbook. So anything to do with interaction between the instructor and the students, or more importantly, actually interaction between the students, so peer-to-peer learning, will take place within that digital textbook. And so chat rooms and blogs and that kind of thing, creating e-portfolios together, working, collaborating together in that space. Will be a textbook, but it will also be a classroom. So really, you don't need to be in a physical space altogether anymore.
I want to understand why unions are saying that their freedom of association rights are being violated by the government doing what they're doing. Because it doesn't, as Sonia says, there's no guarantee of outcome in that Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there's a guarantee of process and association.
And I think that Sonia and I would take slightly different takes on what that actually means in terms of scope. But what the Supreme Court held in BC Health Services is that the action of coming together as workers to form a union, maintain a union, participate in the activities of a union, to bargain collectively is protected as an action of freedom of association. The court, in fact, went further and said that the process of bargaining collectively is the most fundamental way in which freedom of association is engaged in the workplace.
So the word association, we can actually read into that union.
Association, freedom of association means the act of coming together and working collectively towards a common goal.
Including forming a labor
forming
union.
a union, but also engaging in the activities of that collectivity, which is collective bargaining, which could be the right to strike. All those actions that workers do together as collective action to advance workplace goals. That's protected under freedom of association. So it's not just a simple process. And in this case, it has to be a meaningful process in which there's a capacity to influence the outcome. And in this case, this legislation tells you what the outcome is. It tells you what you can bargain. And if you don't actually end up with that result, the government's going to impose it on you anyway. So that's not a meaningful process if they've told you this is the scope of what you can talk about and this is what your answer has to be within that scope. That's not
So that's
a
why the
process
unions
of
find that
bargaining.
unconstitutional.
That's not a meaningful process by
Okay.
any stretch.
So the Ontario government obviously is going to go to court and argue the opposite. What are they picking up from this argument here? Are they going to claim that actually, even though association is protected in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, we're still protecting that association, or we're not violating those association rights? Is that what they're going to say?
Well, I've seen it reported that the minister has announced that they intend to take the position that the collective bargaining, the process of collective bargaining has in fact been respected, and the requirements under the Charter in fact have been met. And so what we know is after the Fraser case, which rebooted the standard after BC Health Services, there were a couple of cases that the Ontario Court of Appeal had a chance to elaborate on what that standard may mean when thinking about what makes up meaningful dialogue that forms this process of collective bargaining that's required. And in a similar case, the Association of Justice Council, where there was federal wage restraint legislation imposed, the Association of Justice Council argued that that legislation that imposed a wage freeze in fact was unconstitutional and a violation of freedom of association. And the Court of Appeal, looking at BC Health Services and the standards set out in Fraser, said, you know what, what's required here is the ability to have meaningful dialogue. And essentially what the Court of Appeal has interpreted the Fraser standard to mean is the opportunity for a trade union to make representations to the employer, and for the employer, the requirement for the employer to listen and take on board those representations and to consider them in good faith.
There was a time in Ontario when governments dreamt big and built big. But in today's economic climate, is this version of what's possible in our public spaces part of a bygone era? Dave, get us started on this track. One of the biggest differences between today and when Ontario Place was built is that back then they balanced their budget every year. There were no financial crises the likes of which we're dealing with today. So is it possible today for the City of Toronto, the City of Ottawa, whatever, Hamilton, London, these major metropolitan areas in our province, or the province of Ontario, or frankly the government of Canada, everybody's got no money now. Can you dream big and think big when you don't have any money?
No, but not having money is a malleable thing. The economy obviously shifts, and the economy isn't good now. We're also living in a time where a lot of people are buying into this idea that if government takes your money and spends it, it's a waste. And if the private sector takes your money and spends it, it's amazing. So that doesn't make much sense. I think people are smarter than that. I think we can move beyond that. But we often talk about, you hear conservative politicians especially saying, let's run government like a business. And then they go on to mean that means let's reduce our costs, because businesses always want to keep costs down.
Well, it just means let's not lose money. That's what it means.
But businesses also try and increase revenue. I don't see a lot of conservatives talking about that. And businesses also build things. They spend money on things. So there's a difference between responsible government and small government, and somehow a lot of folks have been able to successfully link those two in the public dialogue around what government should do.
How do we dream big and consider these, big, once-in-a-generation public projects if we don't have any money?
It's really tough, there's no question, because there are all these kind of macro factors that are making it more difficult, right? So we've got 30 years of income stagnation, we've got an aging workforce, and, as Dave has pointed out, we've actually ceded a lot of ground in terms of the tax points that we used to collect. So government is having to do a lot more with a lot less at exactly the time we hit that kind of 50-year point since the big build-out in the 60s and 70s, where so much infrastructure simply is outdated, right? And so what are the biggest troubles in this province, especially in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area? It's transit. We need more subways, we need more LRTs, we need more ways to get around from one side of the region to the other.
But we don't want to pay for it.
But we don't want to pay for it, right? And in part, I think that's because there's been a race to the bottom amongst all of the political parties, agreeing amongst themselves that they're going to take revenue options off the table. And it's hard not to have some sympathy for that, because we also see the degree to which families really are pressed these days. Everything is getting more expensive.
So if the SALIMA, the big public dream project, is no longer possible because of the bottom line nowadays, are we into an era where it's public-private, making partnerships, and hopefully something good comes out of it at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think so. I do believe that is a really viable option for the future.
Works.
I mean, you guys asked me how I was earlier, so I think I can tell you that, from my years of and the work that I've seen, I believe that it works. Will the factors change in the future, and will we have to consider other ways of doing things? I think yes. Obviously, what we've learned from Ontario Place is that things change and that we have to be adaptable, and I think that's one of the big lessons that we have to take forward. But, as I listen to this conversation, there's this really kind of polarized thing happening where we're saying public space is owned by the government, and then there's nothing else to talk about. I think that all of us in our lives, we gather as communities, as people, in places that aren't necessarily these iconic projects, and that they aren't necessarily owned by the government. And I think that once we take our frame away from yes or no, and we do start going more into that middle ground of public-private partnership, or maybe all public, or maybe all private, then there's so many more solutions that exist, and that's, I think, a lot of the work that we try to do with the Emerging Leaders Network is about that collaborative approach. It's not.
Let me do a quick follow here. You said projects like Ontario Place, which are quote unquote owned by the government. See, my hunch is there's lots of people in the city who would say Ontario Place is owned by the people. The government, I guess, is technically the trustee, but,
sure.
it's owned by the people.
Sure, I don't disagree with that.
You don't disagree with that?
Not at all. And okay. I think that's exactly why, we need to think about these things differently. That the way that we talk about public space and consultation and all these things of historically how we've always done it is not necessarily how we should do it going forward. And I'm sure Peter has perspective on this, right. But going forward, we live in this generation of the internet and Twitter and, this access to the people like no other, and why are we not using that?
Dave.
I wanted to jump in
okay.
actually on something Selena had said, and you preempted that a little bit by saying the public is about the people. It's not about what's owned or sometimes regulated, but certainly not owned by the government. And we've been talking a lot about big. Is this past the time for big projects? And what I think about all of these projects that were created around the same time, late 60s, early 70s, is it's like an urban forest. You plant all your trees at once, and then going on, a generation or two or 3 or 4 later, your urban forest all dies at once because nobody thought to keep planting new things, different sizes of different varieties. You have a monoculture all of the same age, and that's a problem.
Is that what's happening now?
I think that's a problem with a lot of our public infrastructure. It's not just the money problem, as you raised, in terms of not providing the ongoing infrastructure funding to keep things from falling apart, but do we need always to think about being what's big, as Selena suggests?
In terms of your comment about, the public-private partnerships, I totally agree there's a room for everything. We should always be exploring all those kinds of options. But it's important to recognize that when a space is owned by the public or the government versus when it's owned by some kind of private entity, it changes your rights as a user. So if I stand on the street or in a library or a school or or city hall, I have a certain amount of freedom of expression, freedom of mobility. No one can tell me to leave because they don't like what I'm doing. And if you're in a mall or any place that feels public, if you're in the Eden Center, it feels like, oh, I'm on a main street. You're not.
No, it's private property.
Privately owned, and they can kick you out for whatever reason they want. You can't hand out flyers. You can't put up posters. Even Young Dundas Square is this strange arrangement that isn't purely public. You're not allowed to write on Dundas Square with chalk. Security will come out and ask you to stop. So it's important that just because something feels public doesn't mean it is. But one more quick thing. I really want to challenge this premise that governments don't have money and the private sector does, therefore we should go to them. Because I think it's a myth. It doesn't make any sense because they both get their money from the same place, from us.
Okay, Joe Morton, I'm going to get you to comment on this next piece of tape that we're going to show because I suspect you went to see her. Christine Lagarde was in town last week, last Thursday night, of course, former French finance minister, head of the IMF now, talking about how difficult it is to try to get progress on the economy in the European Union because while they have monetary union, they sure do not have political union. Right. So let's watch this tape and then we'll get you to comment. Roll tape, please.
You have on the ground 17 nations with their respective sovereignty, their respective national anthem, their respective flag, their respective defense. You have 17 parliaments, you have 17 Supreme Courts, and all these are bound by one single currency, which has been put in place under the premise that it would be the starting point for a fiscal and economic zone, to which few people paid a lot of attention for a period of time because there was growth, because things were working, because the currency was holding, up until such time when the crisis hit. And that's when they realized that the economic union, the fiscal union, had not been put in place, and were doubt about the solidity of one of the 17 or two of the 17th suddenly cast a doubt over the whole construction. That's what happened, and that's what they are addressing bit by bit, directive by directive, and one step at a time. It's frustrating. It's taking too long, and much longer than one is used to when you already have a federation of states.
Is economic progress impossible when you need 17 aye votes for everything?
I would think so. I mean, let's be clear, it's a complicated situation. But with the sovereign debt crisis, I mean, you had irresponsible governments, and we had a seminar on this conference yesterday at the school, and we showed interest rates for the decade up until the crisis. And the fact is, Greece and Spain could basically borrow almost at the same level as Germany could. In other words, nobody was pricing the risk in. And that was irresponsible on the part of the governments, but it was also irresponsible on the part of the bankers. And so the thing went kafooey, and it's going to take an awful lot of effort to get it back together. But as Chris said at the school yesterday, the United States had its ups and downs in its first 25 years, as did Canada. And I think that's a point we shouldn't forget.
We'll go, you know what, we're going to come back to the history angle on this later, because that's a good point. We will come back to that. But on that Christine Lagarde clip, what jumps out at you?
There's no doubt that the political, economic structure, the financial system around which the euro exists is deeply flawed. But we're in a race. Okay? It's a race, and some people believe that the efforts of the European Central Bank, the IMF, a lot of leaders of Europe are going to move us closer to a system in which these things are done on a federal basis rather than a country basis, where you have to have permission of each country to go ahead.
If this is a race, what's the finish line?
Okay, the finish line is that there's going to be enough of a structure, financial structure, banking, federal banking, and federal debt of a kind that the central bank can discount. More tax revenues in the federal structure, so as you have there be automatic distributions. If that can occur, okay, in time, before the lack of growth and all the other problems causes so much social unrest that there is just people are out on the street, sufficiently out on the streets that it becomes untenable, then it will work. But the problem that Europe has gotten itself into is there is no good solution. If we get rid of the euro, that's going to be very, very costly, and keeping it together is going to be very, very costly.
If we go back to, let's say, 1867, or go back to 1776, you have the new creation of a new country, Canada and the United States, and obviously you had these independent entities, provinces or states, which suddenly were coming together to create a new financial system. I mean, it sounds a lot like what the EU just tried to do in some respects. So put what they're doing right now today in that kind of historical context for us.
We've acquired from the Houghton Library at Harvard University the digital copy of Sir John A. Macdonald's copy of the 1787 Secret Proceedings in Congress, which was published in 1833. And
secret proceedings of what?
Of the Congressional Congress, which met to draft the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
And what he clearly studied what had gone wrong in the United States. And I think that was why he fought for a strong central government. He recognized the politics of Quebec, that he couldn't have it. And so what did you do? He brought this system together, and a key factor is in both countries was that the central authority absorbed the debt. In both countries, and I think Canada, learning from the experience in the United States, the debt was absorbed by the central authority in the initial instance.
And there's something that should be added to that. It gave a clean slate, or virtually clean slate, to everyone. And you can't do that in Europe. There was too much debt, quite frankly. I don't think anyone would accept that. But along with that was the principle that if states went on and borrowed, they could go bankrupt. And that's one of the things that is so difficult about the way we've constructed the Eurozone, is that it is very, very difficult to allow any one of the countries to go bankrupt, because it's their debt that is we use to create money in the European zone. It's that what is being discounted by the central bank.
Jacob, are there any lessons that you think the European Union should be taking from the Canadian and or American examples of almost 150 or almost 250 years ago?
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly several. And I think that the principal design flaw of the common currency union is really that it is a standalone monetary union. And we know from economic history in Canada and in the United States that crises happen. The problem is that the euro area was initially designed as if there was never going to be a crisis in the euro area. Because what happens in a large financial crisis? It almost invariably, there is going to be a bailout. Now, I acknowledge that in some cases in early history, in both Canada and the United States, you had states that were allowed to go bankrupt, but I would argue that that's not really a credible policy to implement in the, shall we say, post-World War II era. So what the Europeans forgot, or I would say that they were forced by the political situation in the early 1990s to discard, was the banking union and the fiscal union, which is now sort of very grudgingly and piece by piece being put together as a result of the crisis. Because what the European or the euro area lacked, and what we discovered that was lacking in this crisis, was the ability to grant a bailout.
Jacob Kierkegaard, it's good of you to join us from the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington, D.C. Come visit us again. Thanks for joining us tonight. And Chris Kobrak, the professor of finance at ESCP Europe, Paris campus, now splitting his time in Toronto, and Joe Martin, director of Canadian Business History at the Rotman School of Management at the U of T. Thanks so much, everybody. And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, or on our iTunes channel, or on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.